Supercuts!
And what they're trying to convey to you, quite sincerely, is that ET is, just beyond, either our five senses or beyond, where NASA can detect them. And they're watching. They're here. They're not going to leave until the job's done. They're here. It's not like Jesus who was here and then left.
Our story really started in around 1936 when Germany recovered a flying disc. It is not clear whether they entered into an agreement with the aliens and were given the disc, or whether they took the disc, or whether the disc crashed and they just came in possession of it. The method by which they did this is not clear. It is clear, however, that they had a disc as early as 1936, that they were attempting to duplicate the technology in an area known as Peenemünde. When we went into that area after World War II, and captured Peenemünde, we found safes, file cabinets, drawers loaded with documents on the alien technology and on the attempts to reproduce the technology. We found pieces and portions of hardware. We found some of the scientists in our sweep trying to recover them. Many of them, however, were captured by the Russians. Much of the hardware was also captured by the Russians, and the Russians may have captured the original disc, because we certainly didn't get it to my knowledge. Notice I say to my knowledge because I was not privy to every scrap of information. When we found this at the close of World War II, we were extremely concerned. We didn't know what to do about it, but we immediately set the scientists about working on trying to duplicate the technology, or at least come up with it on our own. Most of it we did not have to duplicate until 1947, what was described as the Roswell incident. The Roswell incident is a true incident. It did occur. It occurred near the city of Roswell, New Mexico. And what actually happened, there was a thunderstorm. A disc was seen flying over two cities in the direction where the wreckage was found. The disc either exploded in the air or hit something in the air. But whatever happened, we know it happened in the air because debris was found in two different locations. There were large amounts of small debris scattered over a ranch that belonged to a Mr. Brazel, who was an old-time cowboy. He was a very honest man and reported it. Several miles away, there was a large, intact majority of the saucer, actually, or the disc, found on the ground with several dead alien bodies. The reason I say several is there are accounts that there were 4. I saw pictures of 3 of those dead alien bodies in a report called Project Grudge, which also included material from a report called Blue Book Report Number 13. So, I'm not sure whether there were 3 or 4. I saw photographs of 3 of those bodies for sure. Really, it doesn't make any difference if there was 1 or 50. The important thing is that it occurred and that there were dead alien bodies that were not of this world. The technology was not of this world. We could find nothing within that craft that we knew anything about. We could not find electrical wires, we could not find vacuum tubes, we could not find hydraulic actuators, accumulators, control valves. We didn't know what made this thing tick. Immediately, it was classified secret. It was carted away. The press was told first that they had recovered a flying saucer. Second, that no, it wasn't a flying saucer, it was a weather balloon. When the local newspaper tried to put it out on the wire service was interrupted, and a message came across the wire to the local news service stating that they were to cease transmission immediately. What they were transmitting concerned the national security. The message was from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And this is documented. The witnesses are still alive and have so testified to this fact. What happened over the next several years, really that's the most important thing that initially happened. The second most important thing that happened, and there were other crashes in between, the second most important thing that happened is that we found 2 disks in the vicinity of Aztec, New Mexico in 1948, which contained human body parts. Now, this caused the classification to go from secret to way above top secret, because there was a great fear of a national panic. Now, this was before they ever did a study to determine whether or not they believed the populace would panic if the information that aliens were here was disseminated. But they knew that if they told the public, or if it got out to the public by some means, that aliens were not only here, but were flying around in craft which contained human body parts, that's another story altogether. Now, I don't want you to get real concerned about this, because your chances of being affected by it personally are extremely remote.
I have had the experience personally of being at conferences, and I've had a number of people come up to me and say, I used to be a Christian until, and then they would relate to me some experience they had, or an experience of someone that they knew, that they trusted, that they just had, there's no reason this person should lie to me. I've known them X number of years, or they're a family member. And what they proceed to tell them really sort of alters their paradigm. And then they're confronted with a choice. Well, do I believe this, or do I believe, what my faith has taught me? Maybe I should go talk to my pastor. A lot of them do, and a lot of them get dismissed or laughed at, or maybe you need therapy or something sort of condescending or dismissive. And those sort of events sort of trigger a new path for many people. And they begin to process the UFO, ET issue. Not in terms of, I really need to dig into this and find out what it is, but they embrace its reality almost by default. And that begins to, in their mind, displace their view, their cosmology, their worldview, and ultimately their faith. So I want to talk about why, to those people, that makes sense. And I hope that you'll be sympathetic to what they're thinking, and also that you'll be moved to perhaps do a better job on your own in study of Scripture, and especially for those in the ministry, that it would motivate you to start thinking more seriously about this. So, with that introduction,
we're seeing an increase in the UFO activities. Well, what does Scripture say? That, Satan comes down with great wrath and vengeance because he knows his time is short.
Let's talk about the potential of the return of the Nephilim in the last days. Are they coming back? Well, going back to that chart, looking at what happened, Yeshua said it was as the days of Noah, right? Not the days of Jared. Now, after the first generation Nephilim were killed, the first generation, the Watchers were judged, bound, and buried for how long? 70 generations, right? We get that information from 1 Enoch chapter 10, verse 12. For 70 generations they shall be buried. Well, Psalm 90, verse 10 defines a generation as 70 years, 80th by strength. Well, if you just went on the low side, 70 times 70, 4,900 years, from roughly 3000 BC, brings us to the beginning of the 20th century. 4,900 years from 3000 BC, beginning of the 20th century. Makes you wonder, think about that. Think about the 20th century. Think about the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 1800s and crossing over into the 1900s. It was basically a flat line, right? In terms of transportation, horse and buggy, beasts of burden and stuff like that. To all of a sudden, locomotives, planes, trains, automobiles, supposedly sending people to the moon, and airplanes and space probes and all that in like 50 years, 60 years, less than 100 years. What happened? I think we may be looking at the return of the Watchers. I think that they maybe are being systematically released. I don't know if they're all released at the same time, but if you look at the Book of Enoch of what the Watchers taught men to do, and you look at what men started doing in the 20th century, it's a really good match. I was looking at some information regarding knowledge and transportation in a pre-flood world. I believe was way more advanced than we are. What we're doing with computers and stuff, I believe they were doing with their brain. I think they were doing, they had a better understanding of crystals and all kinds of stuff. I mean, I think they were far more advanced than we are today. Of course, the flood narrows it down to 8 people, and then after that, they start to repopulate the earth. And by the time you get to the Tower of Babel, you got about 600,000 men, at least, by the time of the Tower of Babel. And so, assuming that some of that wisdom and understanding was retained in Noah and his 3 sons and was passed on to the successive generations, they're all together in the plains of Shinar under the leadership of Nimrod, and their plan is to build a tower to reach into heaven. And if you keep reading throughout the other texts, their plan was to kill God. Effectively, they're like, oh, really? God wiped out the whole pre-flood world? Huh. All right, let's take God out. That's what their plan was. So God said, oh yeah? I'm going to mess up your languages. Which was a brilliant move on God's part. Because if this is what they're going to do with all this wisdom and understanding, what better way to knock all that wisdom down than to confuse everybody's languages so that you can't understand what the other guy's saying? So there are 70 different people groups, 70 different languages. They all went away from the same place talking about the same god Nimrod, now with different names because they have different languages. We'll talk about that in the next session. They all go away. Now what happens if you got you got Tesla and Einstein in your group? And then this other group over here has Pee Wee Herman, and well, not much good. These guys are the guys going to be, carving on caves. There's a pretty horse. You see how wisdom, knowledge, and understanding can be easily chopped way down from what it was just by the act of confusing languages, easily. And then it kind of fluctuates, and transportation stays pretty much the same. Horse and buggy, beast of burden. There's some peaks and valleys of knowledge and wisdom and understanding. But then you hit the late 1800s, early 1900s, and
it doesn't take any insight to realize that the whole UFO area is full of hoaxes, nonsense, and foolishness. And indeed, many people are here in Roswell just in good-natured kidding and having fun. But when you strip away the hoaxes on the one hand, and when you strip away the deliberate disinformation by some very well-resourced groups on the other hand, what you have left is disturbingly real. There are occasions where these UFOs are confirmed. They're tracked on radar, leave radiation behind. They're tangible on the one hand. And on the other hand, they behave in ways that totally defy our perception of physical laws. There are many people that presume that they are from some other galaxy or in some outer space context. However, those of you that have done serious research in this area know that the most competent researchers in this area, people like J. Allen Hynek, who passed away a few years ago, and Jacques Vallée and others, have come to the conclusion they're not from some other galaxy, they're from another dimension within our own.
The next really important occurrence was the fact that in 1949, again near Roswell, 2 discs crashed. They recovered 5 alien bodies from these discs, and in combing the area to make sure that they had recovered all of the wreckage and everything that they could so that the public would not be able to discover anything, and so that they would have everything with which to gain knowledge and technology from, they scoured the area by foot patrol, by jeep patrol, and by aircraft reconnaissance and discovered an alien live from the crash wandering in the desert. They captured him. He was designated EB, extraterrestrial biological entity. EB was taken to Los Alamos, where he was placed in a Faraday-shielded environment because he had the ability to read the thoughts and transmit thoughts to people outside of where he was being held captive. He also had the ability, through a device that he wore around his waist, to literally walk through walls. Now, we know through our own study of science that this is not far-fetched. We know that mass, or matter, is made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms. And in between these atoms, there's quite a large space on that scale. And in between the molecules, there is a large space on that scale also. It's much like being out in space and looking at the solar system. If the sun and each of the planets, if you were to consider them to be molecules, if you could get way down microscopically and look inside your own hand, you would see much the same thing. There are large spaces between them. They're held together by a force or an energy, which we know very little about. With the proper technology, you could literally put your hand through your other hand if you knew how to do that. The aliens apparently do, because they can not only walk through walls, but they are apparently able to abduct you from your bed in the middle of the night and lift you out through your ceiling without opening any doors, without lifting the roof, without opening any windows, and you pass right through it with no ill effects, and they can put you right back down in your bed in the same manner. Now this sounds totally insane, doesn't it? Doesn't it really? Because I have to tell you, quite frankly, when I was reading this material, and when I was studying the abductee reports, and when I first came across this, I thought it was crazy. I thought it was insane, until I realized that it was absolutely real.
There is a growing interest in all this ET stuff, and I have a number of polls here, samples. This is 1947 U.S. Gallup poll. Of course, 1947, a very deliberate year, very deliberate choice on my part. And you look at the responses, I don't know, 33%, imagination, almost a third, hoax, secret weapons, so on and so forth. Other explanations, 9%. If you look at the list here, the other explanations is, pretty much, the alien view. But a lot of people had heard, if you look at the bottom, 90% had at least heard of flying saucers, but nobody was really processing them in terms of an extraterrestrial idea, at least initially. 1957, do you believe there's some possibility that they, the saucers, may be objects from outer space? Now we've crept up to 25% that are, I think that's possible. Here are some more Gallup polls. You look at the years. The years from these samplings are 1966, 73, 87, and 1990. And the reason there are gaps in the panels here is because not all the same questions were asked and the results given in the sources I had, so I spaced them out that way. But the three questions here from the poll: have you ever heard or read about flying saucers? Well, it's consistently 90% or above. You have a gap, 96 in 1966 to 90% in 1990. It's a new generation. You have young people in the poll, so there's a variance there, but it's still plus 90. In your opinion, are they something real or imagined? And it's consistently hovering now, just 10 years after the 57 poll. You got almost 50%, and then the rest of the polls seem to hover right around 50%, that yes, they're definitely real. And then they threw in another question: are people somewhat like ourselves living on other planets? And that has essentially climbed from about a third to almost half. Now, if this is 1990, if the statistical trends are going to be consistent, if roughly half the population of the United States today believes that, there's probably life forms, ET out there living on other planets, there's something like us, that's a lot of people. And my guess is that some of those people are going to be in your church. I mean, just the odds are that you're going to get that. There's actually been growing interest in ET life and religion specifically that is more part of academia. So I want to say something about that. Typically, when you come across studies on how somebody's belief in the extraterrestrial nature of UFOs or alien life, or connecting the idea of alien life with flying saucers, when those kind of surveys intersect with religion, they usually focus on how people who are religious, who are serious about it, might react to the disclosure of a genuine ET reality, or how such disclosure might affect their beliefs. And I've pulled out a couple of these. The Brookings Report is one you've probably all heard of. This wasn't specifically a study about religion, but it was in part of it commented on the religious effect of what might happen if all of a sudden the world, specifically the United States, for the sake of the survey, the report, what the reaction might be if it was all of a sudden disclosed that, yep, there are aliens, they've been coming here, they pilot flying saucers, that sort of thing. And it was very negative. The Brookings report concluded that this would just be a result in a tremendous upheaval of the world's cultures, and specifically in the United States, conservative Christianity. The term fundamentalist is used in the report, that this would really rock their world and cause incredible social upheaval. And so you'll often see this report referenced by, in the context of the disclosure question. Why don't they just tell us, why doesn't the government just tell people what's going on? And the answer is usually something like, well, it's just going to freak too many people out, especially those religious people, and they're just not going to be able to handle it. So that becomes a rationale for concealing something. Of course, there's other rationales. Alexander UFO Religious Crisis Survey, 1994. This one was featured on Coast to Coast AM at the time it came out. And this one was a little more optimistic. It cast religious people as being a little more accepting, certainly than the Brookings report would indicate, but also just in general. And it was sort of viewed as a move toward proving or providing evidence that disclosure wouldn't be that big of a deal. There was a Roper poll after that in 2002. This was actually done for Scientific American, UFOs and ET Life, Americans' Beliefs and Personal Experience. Again, that also had a few religious questions in it, again aimed at those who would practice some sort of faith, and it was very broad. So was the Alexander Religious Crisis, UFO Religious Crisis Survey. Basically, they're including traditional monotheistic religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, but then they're also going to have Eastern religions in there. Same with the Roper poll. And so it was pretty scattershot, and the poll was criticized, both of these, and I was one of the criticizers here a few years ago in Roswell, in the early 2000s when Ancient of Days started, because neither of these polls included people that my background is I'm trained as a biblical scholar. I taught in Christian colleges, I taught in universities, biblical studies, and since a teenager, I've grown up, teenager and beyond, in the context of what we would loosely call evangelicalism, even though that term doesn't really mean a whole lot anymore. Basically, people who would take Christianity seriously in the major doctrines, the idea of evangelism, that sort of thing. Not any of the mainline broad denominations. But I knew there were people in that context that would give dramatically different answers to some of these poll questions. And so my gripe at the time was it's not an accurate reflection of what people would really think. And along this last year came the Peters ETI Religious Crisis Survey. If you do go to my blog, you could search for this. I have the link up there, and you can just Google that. Ted Peters is a famous scholar involved in the academic study of the interface of science and religion. He teaches at Pacific Lutheran University and graduate school. He might be retired now. He might still be there. Peters has written a number of books, a number of articles on this subject, and he was the first to really include, specifically as a specific category, evangelicals. And the results he got were kind of interesting. His survey sounds a lot like the older Alexander Crisis Survey. People thinking, it's not going to alter my worldview at all. High percentages for what we would think of as Bible believers. Like 80% are okay with ideas like, if there are aliens that come here and tell us that they had a hand in creation of humankind, would this alter your beliefs or not? Oh, no, I'd be fine with it. And I read the results of that, and he has all the results tabulated and put in nice little Excel graphic pictures. You can go up to the website and look at them. Questions and results. And I thought, boy, either we have people, or we have churches just filled with people who just don't know much about doctrine at all, or there's some fudging going on here, or people are really sincere. They really mean what they're saying. They would still cling to their faith, not realizing how it really is impacted. And I looked at the survey as kind of an improvement, but also a little bit disturbing, and it sort of drew me into this thought process of, it went from why is this all of a sudden sort of acceptable, into, if people really thought about this, could they really discern the difference between what is put forth by, I'll just call them the ET believer community, the First Church of Extraterrestrial Deity, and traditional Christianity? Why is this so hard to parse? Why are people so sort of willing to, I can accept this idea, I can sort of swap ET in here, and it's pretty much the same thing. And so that's what got me thinking about this.
I think it's not a coincidence that you have, the 1947-48 time frame. You've got some huge events happening. You have the Roswell incident happening, which launched the whole modern UFO alien lore. There were certainly experiences and things prior to that are documented, but that really kicked off everything, the Roswell event.
You also have characters showing up in the beginning of the 20th century, like Aleister Crowley. Showing up, he does in January through March of 1918, famed occultist Aleister Crowley began a series of magical experiments called the Emelantra workings, in which he is said to have opened a portal to another dimension, allowing an entity, I believe a demon, or possibly a fallen angel, named Lamb to enter through it. Could this have been one of the ways that these guys were released? Their prison sentence was nearing an end anyway, if not coming to an end completely. And then through the act of man, these guys start being released, maybe. Interesting, this is the picture he drew in 1918 of the entity that came through. Looks a whole lot like the alien grays of today's pop culture. Interesting. Well, he had some disciples, namely Jet Propulsion Laboratory founder and rocket fuel scientist Jack Parson, and Scientology and Dianetics founder L. Ron Hubbard. These guys were disciples of Crowley. And in March of 1946, at a location that later became known as Area 51, these guys started doing an experiment they called the Babylon working. Like the Emelantra working, it was based on ceremonial sex magic. Unlike Crowley, however, they were not as adept at opening and closing portals, and theirs apparently stayed open, and the modern UFO era began 1 year later, 1947, the same year Crowley died. Interesting timing. Is it also just coincidental that at the same time, when all that's going on, the Dead Sea Scrolls are found? From 1946 to 1956, they kept finding stuff in these caves that were buried, like the Book of Enoch. And if you open up the Book of Enoch and read chapter 1, the first couple of verses says, this book is not written for this generation, but for a remote future generation who is to come, that will live in the day of tribulation. How many of you think we're getting close to the last days? It says right in the first few verses of Enoch, hey, this is for that generation. And we just so happen to find these books. That's why I think there's value in these books. Because they give us a great deal of information about what was going on with these watchers the first time around. And if they're being released, they're going to be doing a lot of deceiving. Right? This whole weekend is called Decoding Deception. Well, a whole lot of deception is coming from these guys. I think the timing is really interesting. Again, is it just a coincidence that these books are popping up right at a time such as this? And I mentioned Daniel earlier, where it talks about in the last days knowledge shall increase. Well, Daniel also says in Daniel 2:43, whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they, who's they, shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. So we have human seed being mixed with they. Who are they? But they, whoever they are, shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. I think this is a prophetic, this is something that may be being fulfilled in the whole alien abduction thing. If you start looking into people like Dr. David Jacobs and others that do interviews with people who claim to have been abducted and had things done to them, over and over and over and over again, you hear testimony of them being put into like a laboratory type setting where they're having seed and eggs extracted and embryos implanted and fetuses removed. It's all very scientific. There's blending taking place there, but it's not taking place through copulations. They're not having sex. It's all very scientific. I think that's what this could be, a fulfillment of this prophecy right here.
To consider the possibility that these UFOs, and more importantly their occupants and whatever, are coming to us not from some far galaxy, although they seem to be posing as if they are, but they come from another dimension, and that has profound implications for you and I. Now, we have trouble going up in dimensions. If I start talking 4 or 5 dimensions, you and I will be at a loss because we're not specially trained in that way. But we can gain some insights by imagining something less than 3 and drawing some inferences. Let's imagine a world that has only 2 dimensions, like a plane. Let's imagine in our imagination that there are occupants with 2-dimensional occupants within that 2-dimensional plane. Now, if we came along as a 3-dimensional person and put our finger through that plane, what would the 2-dimensional people in that 2-dimensional world observe? A circle, or a hole, yes, in a sense. Right, exactly. Let's take another example. If a 3-dimensional sphere is passing through that 2-dimensional universe, it will appear as a point that enlarges to a circle and then that reduces back to a point, because they would be perceiving a 2-dimensional slice of that 3-dimensional object passing through. Are we together? Now, let's assume we didn't have a circle, we had some other kind of an object, here represented such as a cube. If that cube tumbles through that space, not only will it start from a point and get big and then shrink, it will change shape as it goes through, and depending on how it's being cut by that plane. Are we together so far? There are many. Jacques Vallée, who's probably one of the most prominent published people in the UFO area, has suggested that these UFOs may be windows into another dimension more so than objects. And you and I have a tough time relating to that, but he may be very, very correct. Let's assume that we were trying to communicate a 3-dimensional object to a 2-dimensional world. We would be asking that 2-dimensional world to encounter things that they don't encounter in their experience. Our imaginations are generally limited to our own experiences. One way we could try to do it if we had a cube would be to project that 3-dimensional image into a 2-dimensional space and maybe rotate it, but its behavior in the 2-dimensional space would be bizarre to the 2-dimensional occupants in any case. Now, another way we could do that would be to take a 3-dimensional cube, say, and unravel it into 2 dimensions. And we would take that 2-dimensional cube and start to unfold it and lay it out flat. And that would be a way, possibly, to try to get a 2-dimensional being that we're communicating with to recognize what a 3-dimensional cube might be. But all of these are very imperfect because we're asking that 2-dimensional being in a 2-dimensional world to extend their concepts into a dimension, into a region that they have no experience with.
I want you to also bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that it was not too long ago, and it really wasn't too long ago, that if you mentioned to someone else that in a few years man would be flying through our own atmosphere, you would have been laughed at, ostracized, and probably kicked out of town. Then not long after that, when we did have aircraft and were carrying passengers flew through the air, if you had suggested to your neighbor that in a few years a man would be walking on the moon, you would have been laughed at, ridiculed, and maybe run out of town. Literally, when we put a man on the moon is when I realized that nothing is impossible. Nothing ever again can be impossible. The next most important thing that happened after they found EB, it came a few years later. EB became ill and they tried to save him. They were unsuccessful. They didn't know how to go about it. But in an attempt to save him, and also in an attempt to gain favor with this technologically superior race, they began broadcasting out into space for help. We have one of your people here who crashed in one of your ships. We're trying to save his life. He's dying. Please help us save his life. By doing that, they hoped, number one, to make contact, number two, to make friendly contact, number three, that the aliens would see us as a benevolent people trying to help one of theirs and would not attempt to destroy us or hurt us. Because we realized that their technology was so far ahead of ours that in any military confrontation of any kind, we would have had no chance whatsoever. And basically that is still true today. What should give you good feelings is that if the aliens wanted to, they could have done anything that they wished to us many, many years ago, and they have not done that. So I see that as good. Hopeful. I see it pregnant with all kinds of hope and possibilities for the future. Because we know as the human race, what we usually do to an inferior culture, if we're technologically superior, is usually not that good. So there is a great deal of hope. There's a great deal of promise in that. E.B. died in June of 1952. As of the time of E.B.'s death, we had not had any answer to the message that we had sent out into space. The movie that you saw, called E.T., is the story of E.B. They have changed some things around to make it more palatable to you. The beginning of the story, he's running around in the desert. He's lost. The government is chasing him. In the real story, the government caught him. In the movie, the little boy gets him. And they form this symbiotic relationship. They're each getting something from the other. And it's a wonderful story. Well, in real life, the real life E.B. was assigned an Air Force officer to watch over him, become his friend, get as much information from him as he could, be his mentor, be his captor. And the same symbiotic relationship developed between E.B. and this Air Force officer, to the point where when E.B. died, the Air Force officer cried. He was deeply hurt. He'd lost a dear friend because he had been with E.B. literally night and day since they had found him. In the movie, E.B. gets very ill, and everybody's very concerned. And the little boy plays the role of the Air Force officer. And you see that he cries. But in the film, he lives. E.T. Call Home was Project Sigma to attempt to make communications with the aliens to come and help save the life of E.B. The government, ladies and gentlemen, is giving you information at an unprecedented rate every day. They are trying to get to your subconscious and tell you the story of what has happened over the last 44 years. So that when the truth comes out, it is not a critical shock. You will be prepared for it. You will understand what is happening.
Now, if you read the scholarly literature, scholars tend to divide people who are interested in UFOs into four groups. There's the materialist. Okay, I would describe these people, these are agnostics or atheists. They're kind of the nuts and bolts people. They're interested in it from a technological point of view or a physics point of view. Again, nuts and bolts kind of people. SETI would be an example. Yes, we think ET life is out there, but we really don't like UFOs. Then you have the physicalists. These are the people who see UFOs as real alien craft from other worlds and that have been coming to Earth for millennia, and they're responsible for the world's religions. Now, if you've ever read any of these authors, Sitchin, von Daniken, this is where they're at. They believe it's physically true, physically real. They've been coming here thousands of years, and they're responsible for Jesus and Muhammad and Buddha, and, fill in the gap. They're responsible for all this stuff. And again, I think they sort of they really have to stick to the idea of an alien being some being from another planet, as opposed to interdimensional or some of these other ideas, demonic hypothesis. So you have the physicalists. They're really committed to that view. Theosophy is a branch of occult studies, broadly defined. Occult and esoteric mystical traditions and motifs. This view would essentially say UFOs are spiritual entities. Here's where you get into the sort of metaphysical idea of beings coming from other dimensions and that sort of thing, and not using that to process it in biblical terms, but using that to process the idea in mystical, occultic, esoteric terms. UFOs are spiritual entities, spirit guides. It's very shamanistic. Abduction experiences are cast as shamanistic experiences. Even despite the violence, they're a moment of religious conversion in the sense that, like with shamans, the gods have chosen you, and they're going to afflict you. It's going to be sort of a trial by fire, or trial to see your worthiness to get this information, but they're going to give you this information, and you begin to feel special. You begin to feel like a conduit for secret knowledge and that sort of thing. Again, a very mystical approach. This category overlaps a bit with, I say a bit, in some people's minds, with Christian stuff because of a guy named Emanuel Swedenborg. How many of you have ever heard of Swedenborg? Just I see hands going up. Swedenborg was a clergyman, and he's probably the oldest modern example of someone, theologian or not, who wrote about, this is in the late 1600s, wrote about contact with extraterrestrials, with alien beings. He actually uses terms like that. Then you have what the literature calls, and this is not my term, but I'm going to use it because I think it's fairly descriptive, even though it's used pejoratively in scholarly literature, which is unfortunate. Christian fundamentalist. UFOs are spiritual phenomena. Yeah, we agree with those theosophists. It's spiritual, all right, but extraterrestrials are demonic manifestations, and they're also the source of that theosophical junk. Okay, and of course, this is going to be the dominant view present here at the conference, as you've already learned if you've listened to the speakers already. So you get these four categories. I personally don't feel like I fit exclusively into any of them. I'm certainly not a materialist. I'm certainly not a physicalist. I'm really not a theosophist either. I don't like that because I'm not into the occult, other than to find out what they think. I think there's a missing category here that I would call eclectic, and that is, I think there's more than one way biblically we can look at extraterrestrials. That doesn't mean that they're not demons. It means I think many of them are, but there could be other ways to process it. So the scholars don't have the eclectic category because they like to pigeonhole people. I want to focus, though, on these two.
So you have in 1918, you got Crowley doing his Emelantra working. The first appearance of what appears to be a gray shows up. A few years later, his student, Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard, do this deal in 1946. And then in 1947, we have the Roswell crash. And then, interestingly enough, so that's 46, 47. 47 also is when the Dead Sea Scrolls pop out. I think we have an example here of move and counter move. Devil's making a move. God says, oh yeah? I'm going to tell everybody what's going on. Out pops the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the books of Jubilees and Joshua and Enoch pop out and show us what the enemy's plan is. Show us who these creatures are, what they are, how they came to be. God is faithful to preserve His Word. I'm not going to argue whether or not those things are canonized Scripture or not. I'm not going to go there. They're not in the canon, fine. But God preserved them for us for such a time as this, even if they're just for historical value, to help us understand what's going on in the canonized Scripture.
In 1953, we detected large objects in space coming toward the Earth. They took up a high orbit around the equator. These objects were determined to be spacecraft intelligently controlled. We did establish communications with them. Arrangements were made for them to land. There were 3 landings in 1954. One took place at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. One took place at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The other one, do not hold me to this because I cannot substantiate it, but I believe it was at Homestead Air Force Base in Florida. I believe that the aliens who contacted us, who were attempting to help us, who refused to give us technology, who wanted to help us with our spiritual development, I believe that that landing took place at Homestead Air Force Base in Florida. But I can't get any verification from that from any source, so don't put that down as fact, put it down as a possibility. The other two bases, the other two landings I know occurred without a doubt at Holloman Air Force Base and Edwards Air Force Base. The first landing occurred at Holloman Air Force Base, where the aliens met with our intelligence officers. They reached a basic agreement after several hours. They were able to communicate. They left one hostage with us, his name was Krill, as a pledge that they would return and formalize an agreement. Later in 1954, they landed again at Edwards Air Force Base. President Eisenhower had arranged to be on vacation in Palm Springs. At the appointed date and time, President Eisenhower was whisked away. He actually disappeared. Nobody even saw the helicopter come or go, but he just flat disappeared. The press was really shook up, and if you read the newspapers during that period of time, you will find that the press literally went wild trying to locate him. They were given a story that he was taken to a dentist for a toothache. They never found a dentist that treated President Eisenhower. In fact, he was at Edwards Air Force Base. He reached a formal agreement with the aliens and a treaty was signed. This was played out in a movie that you saw called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Everything that you saw in that movie, except for finding the ship in the desert and the plains in Mexico and those types of things, was true. People were and are still being abducted. People were and are still being picked up and relocated, decontaminated, brainwashed, given new identities, and put back into society in some other location. It's for their own protection, really. In most cases, in some cases, it's a travesty of justice.
So God is not somebody who has lots of time. God is somebody who's outside the dimensionality of time altogether. And that's what Isaiah means when he says, "Thus saith the high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity." Now, how does he, if he has the technology to create us in the first place, does he have the technology to get a message to us? Of course. The problem is, how does he authenticate his message? How does he let us know that the message we possess is really from him and not some kind of contrivance or some kind of fraud? How many of you here in the audience believe that this is the Word of God? Wonderful. That's the politically correct response in this community. Outside, maybe not so, but here, okay. The question you need to ask yourself desperately is, how do you know? Because if we're correct, before this day is over, you're going to discover that we are being plunged into the greatest cosmic deception that will ever come upon the planet Earth. The lie. The New Testament talks about it. I don't think that's an ism. Mark Eastman and I both believe it's a very tangible, specific thing that we're going to try to cover. And you, as a member of the Christian community, are going to be, in the coming months, coming years, challenged in a way that will require you to really know why you believe this is the Word of God.
People are being implanted. The implants were played out by the silly little tune that people got in their head. That represented the implants. They couldn't get this out of their head. They would have a close encounter with an alien disc, and they would hear this tune, and they could never ever get rid of it. And it drove them to do some crazy things. And there are people today who are being driven to do some crazy things. I know some abductees who wake up one morning after they've had an abduction experience, and they've got to move. And they've got to move to a specific place in a specific state, and they've got to do it right now. And they don't know why. And they've never been there before. And they have no friends there. They don't even know what the place looks like, but they get all their kids, they pack up, and they leave, and they go to Sedona, Arizona. Some of them go to Yelm, Washington. There are areas in the United States where people are being driven to. They don't know why they're going to these places, but they're going there. Usually they have been abducted. Usually they have been implanted. Well, let me take that back. I guarantee you that everyone who has been abducted has been implanted. And the time that I saw the information between 1970 and 1973, the official Office of Naval Intelligence figures was 1 in 40, which works out to 2.5% of the population. How did they get these figures? It's very simple, ladies and gentlemen. At that time, they still had the draft. At that time, they had draft quotas from every state representing a certain percentage of the population. A certain percentage of the population of young men had to be drafted according to the percentage of the total population that lived in that state. When they came in for induction into the military service, they were given an extensive medical examination, and even at that time, ladies and gentlemen, we did have magnetic resonance imaging capability, but the military did not put it out to the civilian community as yet. This was a new technique, a new development. They found that according to the number of implants they found in the military inductees, based upon the percentage of the population of that state from which they were taken, that the number of people in the United States who had been implanted was 1 in 40. I sincerely believe that that was an underestimate, maybe a large underestimate, simply because now today most of the abductees are women, and that sampling was taken from only men.
Materialists and theosophists, at first glance you would think, what in the world do these people have in common? Because the one is the nuts and bolts crowd, not interested in anything religious, and the other one is very mystical. It's my opinion that these are the two groups that I think currently dominate the culture in terms of people who are interested in UFOs. And if you look at them, they dominate the culture. The culture is a combination of materialist and materialist paganized belief systems. They appear like they're at odds, but they're not. If any of you follow sort of current theoretical physics or metaphysics, there's a lot of talk now among the mainstream scientific community in terms of physics, how everything got here, that is very mystical. And that's not actually new. I mean, it's new in terms of how it's filtered down to the popular culture. But for a long time, this whole idea of that the Earth or the universe is a living organism. It's sort of the Gaia hypothesis on steroids, okay? That the universe itself is a living organism. And it came about because it was always there. It produced itself in some mystical... Scientists won't use the word mystical, but they'll try to justify it in terms of quantum physics and things like this. You start seeing a blurring of the lines between these two. At the bottom here, I think the two will be united, and really already are, except for the empirical gap, where spirituality is shown to be entirely natural or material. And this is where I think the ET issue is critical. Because if ET displaces, if it can consistently and coherently displace what we think of as the spiritual, if the natural displaces the spiritual, okay, natural beings, they had to evolve somehow. They're beings that can live and die and all that sort of stuff. If that idea, let's say we were to actually get disclosure that there really are extraterrestrials, it's assumed that they would be so superior that they get elevated to deity status. When that begins to happen, when that idea takes hold, and I don't think you need a flying saucer to land on the White House lawn for that to happen. I think it'd be very simple to trigger this. But once that happens, the materialists are satisfied because, well, yeah, they are gods, but they're the product of evolution. They're technological beings. They're dependent on their technology. We can learn from them. Maybe we can be like them someday. We don't need God. We have them. And you can get the physicalists under the umbrella too, and the physicalists will pipe up and say, yeah, they've been here a long time too, and they're responsible for all that religious stuff. And the materialists would say, well, we used to think we were kooky. But you know what? Now that we're looking at an extraterrestrial, or NASA has admitted that there are extraterrestrials, or NASA has admitted the idea that there really are sort of advanced life forms out there. So that's all you need. Because mentally, people will extrapolate for you. The culture's already prepped through mass media, through decades of exposure to this. They're already prepped to hear the magic words, a couple missions back, we found something that, we thought it was microbial, and it was microbial life, and then we looked a little bit more, we made a few more missions, and sure enough, we're seeing advanced life forms in terms of cellular development, multicellular things, and, even things that we would be able to here on Earth to pick up and look at with our hands. And, that's all that needs to be said, because the culture is so in tuned to believe in random, purposeless, Darwinism, and the idea that this is how life gets here, this is how advanced life gets here, that all of these groups can coexist very nicely if the idea, just the idea, is affirmed in the mainstream. That's all you need. Because then the materialist can look over at the physicalist and say, we used to think we were kooky, but hey, I'm holding an extraterrestrial life form here in my hand, and anything's possible. It makes me want to reconsider, some of those stories. And, boy, an artificial structure here or there, or at least something that's said to be artificial on Mars or the moon or something like that, who knows? That's all people need. That idea alone will displace God. As if you're a Christian, as you think of it. It's very easy to do. The Theosophists are happy because, they've been coming here, and, they're such higher advanced beings that, they can just manifest themselves. Maybe they come in crafts, maybe they don't, that kind of thing. And they gave us Jesus, and Jesus is giving us all this truth because all those other beings, they've been to other worlds, and they've seen all this stuff, and they're so spiritually and ethically advanced. Everybody's happy. Everybody's happy. We can talk about how book religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, could very easily buy into that as well. Just a simple, low-key, low-level disclosure. Very easy. I'm going to try to break these up into outright replacements that UFO, again, I'm calling them UFO believers, again, people who really, extraterrestrials for them really are their religion. They're their gods. They get their whole worldview from this now. There are ways that they outright replace certain components of theism and Christianity. And then there are other ways that they just sort of swap in substitutions or at least parallel certain doctrines and ideas. Let's talk about replacement. Ineffability. Anybody know what that means? Go ahead and shout it out.
You can't identify.
Right. It's beyond sort of the terms of description that we have. Defies description. So it's unknowable. Incapable of being known or understood or defined in any coherent way, which is why in biblical theology, God tells us that you wouldn't know anything about me and get it right unless I told you first. This is where the doctrine of ineffability derives from in terms of what the Bible says. Examples of God revealing himself, Exodus 3:14 is pretty familiar. This is the burning bush incident, I am that I am, so on and so forth, where that particular divine name is revealed. Deuteronomy 29:29, the secret things belong unto the Lord. You can't know my mind completely. The only thing you can know is what I tell you, what I instruct people to write down. Other than that, you're guessing. And you're going to guess wrong because I'm not like anything else. This is why the Israelites were not supposed to make any graven image. Because God isn't like anything you can conceive of, so don't try. It's pointless and it's errant because God's going to be insulted by anything you compare him to that's in your created little world. Isaiah 55, my thoughts are above your thoughts, so on and so forth. Now, UFOs and ET are ineffable in the sense that the nature, now just think about this, the nature and intentions of the aliens are really unknown, and they're unknowable. Now, religion has tended to offer explanations to questions beyond science. See, that's one of the roles as secularists would look at religion. one of the roles of religion is to answer questions that science can't, to fill in those gaps. Well, I would suggest to you that for the ET believing community, that's exactly what ET does for them. They are beyond the edge of science. Where science stops, they begin. Okay, what science cannot answer, they already know. Okay, they fill in this gap. There's no need for the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, if we have ET.
Why they're mostly women, I don't know. It has something to do, I do know, and this may not be the only reason, and that's why I say I don't know what the whole reason is. It has something to do with the attempts for them to preserve their race in an attempt to crossbreed with human beings, either as a direct attempt by implanting or impregnating the female and allowing the baby to come to the first trimester, at which point they're abducted again and the fetus is removed, or by harvesting sperm and ova from selected human beings and attempting to grow this crossbreed in the laboratory. There is tremendous evidence to support this.
Transcendence. Transcendence refers to something being either remote or superior to human existence, of a radically different nature, absolute superiority. Now, there's a positive transcendence. God possesses certain attributes that we do not possess, even in part, and He's so other than we are. And then there are negatives, where God does not have the limitations that we do. Okay, so there's two sides of that coin: transcendence, beyondness, greatness. Here's a quote from Saliba. Although UFO occupants are described as if they had physical bodies, they seem to be spiritual or psychic, some kind of material, immaterial, something in between. Their nature appears to be radically different from that of human beings, surpassing it not only in degree, but also in kind. They are utterly different than you. And that's either because of what they are in terms of species, as, again, UFO ET believers would describe their experiences, or because they have evolved to such a higher state that they're, for all practical purposes, are a different species. Okay, either way you get there. They are transcendent compared to us. So we don't need God for that. Body like Jesus. This is often used in comparison about how Jesus gets into the upper room, without any doors or windows, and you apparently pass through walls. He has a different sort of, it's a physical body, but it's different than the body he had before, all that kind of talk. And ET is often described in the same way, especially in abduction narratives. Again, this is a point of transcendence, beyond humanity. Immanence. The opposite of transcendence is often described as immanence. As transcendence is God is so other and out there, immanence is the idea of closeness or relationship. Biblical theism makes it clear that the transcendent God comes to humanity. This big theme in the Bible. God takes the initiative. He reveals who He is to you, because you ain't going to find out any other way and get it right. So He takes the first step. He reveals Himself to you in various ways, to Israel, to the church, to believers at large. And there are, I don't want to call any of them mundane, but there are less spectacular ways God does that, all the way up to the incarnation. And with Christ. The role of the Spirit is also dealing with immanence. When Christ, of course, that was sort of the ultimate, the incarnation is the ultimate experience of immanence for only a certain number of people, the 12, and then anybody else who got to meet Jesus. When Jesus leaves, what does He say? I'm going to go, but then I'm going to send my Spirit, and the Spirit inhabits believers. And that is the idea of immanence, that God is no longer in a tabernacle, in a temple, on a mountain, some other place. He is not temporarily walking among you as a human being, but He is in all of you, each of you, into which the Spirit comes in response to your faith. So it's a really important idea. ET replaces both through repeated contact to the abductee. And it doesn't have to be abductions, it can be a presence. You'll often hear contactees refer to sort of a presence either in their mind or their head their memory. Again, there's the times of direct contact. There are the messages that are given to the person who has been contacted. That person is supposed to disseminate that information, and oftentimes the ETs are described as, again, not coming to them sort of in a face-to-face way, but filling their minds, sort of a channeling idea. For someone who has had this kind of experience, they're frankly not really interested in the Holy Spirit because it's just not as spectacular. It's just not as, holy cow, there's like something sort of taking over my head here or my mind. It's a substitute, it's a replacement for that kind of idea. And even if you haven't experienced, what is the ET messenger telling you? They're here for you. Okay, they become the prophets and apostles. And they're the ones that tell us, those who haven't had the direct experience, that they're here for you. They're going to come in full force one day to save the planet. Or they're giving you the instructions you need to save the planet. And they're watching. The whole idea of constantly watching. See, now we believe that about God. Okay, but the trick here is that in the contact team message and in his or her theology, and what they're trying to convey to you, quite sincerely, is that ET is, just beyond, either our five senses or beyond, where NASA can detect them, and they're watching. They're here. They're not going to leave until the job's done. They're here. It's not like Jesus who was here and then left. It's not like this spirit thing that I don't know if I've ever really felt that. You see how feeling oriented it is. Okay? It's very easy for the ET message to fill this gap. And that's what it does. Okay, but for a lot of people, especially if you had, again, some sort of minimal disclosure idea, it would be so easy to just, here's how I'm going to process this. I'm going to make it part of my Bible, and not intending to go all the way, but sort of kind of meshing the two. If you don't know, if you don't have some depth in your biblical theology, it's very easy to do that without really knowing, without doing it unwittingly. And I think one of the things that plagues us is we want theological security. Theological teaching in most places is diluted down into a creed, a statement, a paragraph, a doctrinal, one-page doctrinal statement on a website, and that's the Bible. It's a lot easier for people to digest, memorize, commit to the heart, tiny, short formulations of doctrine. Just practical. Okay? I'm not anti-creedal. But I'll tell you, if you never go beyond that, if you never stretch your people beyond that, and the way you don't do that is you avoid tough questions. If you're going to keep avoiding tough questions, if you're going to keep avoiding tough topics, if you're going to keep skipping passages that are out of your comfort zone, okay, if you're going to keep doing those kinds of things, especially to big picture questions like this ET stuff that has so thoroughly permeated the culture, then what you've really done is you've told your people that this is the extent of what you need to know and think about. And it takes half an hour to memorize some of that stuff. Now I've canned it, I'm sitting on the lid, and I'm kind of bored now. I've mastered it all, what should I move on to?
When you study the Bible from Genesis to Revelation and take it seriously, you'll discover it all ties together. If you study the book of Revelation, you discover it's all in code, but every code is explained somewhere else in the Scripture, and when you go through it properly, it takes you into every book in the Bible. And you realize the whole thing is a pre-planned package. Even though 40 different guys penned it over thousands of years, there are fingerprints all over this thing of the Holy Spirit. So you don't have to go to Bible codes and some of these other sort of speculative areas to come back with an awe and a respect for the Bible as it sits in your lap. Now, what does this book tell us? It tells us, first of all, that we are in possession of a message of extraterrestrial origin. So it should not surprise us to find out that UFOs and such are in here, which is the primary subject of our gathering today. The book also portrays us as objects of an unseen warfare. Boy, we better find out what's going on and what the agenda is. Our eternal destiny depends upon our relationship with the winner of this cosmic conflict. And it's not new, but it's becoming increasingly visible. And I believe if our perspective is correct, it's going to come to its climax during our lifetime. Fasten your seatbelts. The question that you have to answer for yourselves before the day is over is, what is your readiness for this encounter? And by the way, just being a sincere Christian in a vital fellowship of some kind ain't enough. Just because you have a Bible in your lap and you're sincere in your Christian faith doesn't mean you've done your homework. Paul instructs you to put on the armor of God. That's an imperative. In order to do that, you better know what it is, and he says the whole armor, not just your favorite parts.